In this gripping story, Dr. Naomi Davis is a trailblazing physician fighting not only for her patients but for justice within the healthcare system. After delivering a bold keynote speech that exposes the deep-rooted racism in her field, Naomi embarks on an ambitious mission to create the Equity in Care Alliance, a program aimed at providing underserved communities with the care they deserve. Along the way, she faces fierce opposition, personal doubt, and overwhelming challenges. Will Naomi's drive be enough to bring lasting change, or will the barriers she faces prove too great to overcome? Dive into Naomi's journey and discover how far she's willing to go to make a difference. Comment below on what you think will be her greatest obstacle, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on her inspiring fight for equity. The quiet hum of Charlotte Douglas International Airport was a familiar sound to Naomi Davis. She had traveled frequently over the last few years, shuttling between conferences, medical missions, and advocacy events, but this trip felt different. Today, as she stood near the departure gate, clutching her boarding pass and glancing at her phone, Naomi could feel a particular weight pressing down on her. Tomorrow, she was scheduled to deliver the most important speech of her career. She checked the time again, even though she already knew her flight was on schedule. Flying from Charlotte, North Carolina to New York City had always been a short, routine trip for her, but today, it felt monumental. The medical conference she was attending wasn't just any conference, it was the conference, the one where all the most important voices in healthcare gathered to share ideas, unveil research, and discuss the future of medicine. Naomi had been chosen to give the keynote address, and she was acutely aware of what that meant. At 38 years old, Naomi had worked relentlessly to make a name for herself in the medical field. As a physician specializing in internal medicine and public health, she had focused much of her career on healthcare disparities in underserved communities. She had earned accolades and respect from her colleagues for her advocacy work, particularly her efforts to bring attention to systemic racism embedded in healthcare institutions. But no matter how many achievements she accumulated, there were always challenges that went beyond the usual difficulties faced by a doctor. Being a black woman in medicine meant fighting for legitimacy at every step. Naomi had grown accustomed to the skepticism, the subtle glances, and the questioning of her credentials that often came from colleagues and patients alike. There were the patients who, upon meeting her for the first time, would ask to see another doctor, assuming that she couldn't possibly be as qualified as the white male doctors they were used to seeing. There were the colleagues who made offhand comments about her success being linked to diversity quotas, never considering the possibility that she had worked harder than anyone else in the room. Naomi had become an expert at navigating these microaggressions, often with a polite smile and unwavering professionalism, but it didn't mean it didn't hurt. Every interaction like this chipped away at her, adding to a reservoir of silent frustration that she kept locked deep inside. As the crowd around the gate began to thicken, Naomi took a deep breath, reminding herself of the importance of her keynote. This was her moment, not just to prove her worth to others, but to speak up for the countless patients and communities that had been left behind by the healthcare system. Her speech wasn't just about disparities in access to care. It was about the lives that had been lost, the opportunities missed, and the pain endured by marginalized communities. It was about racism, not the blatant, violent racism that people were quick to condemn, but the quiet, insidious kind that shaped policies, practices, and attitudes in ways most people preferred not to acknowledge. She glanced out the airport windows. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the tarmac, where planes taxied to and from the gates. The fading light painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a peaceful contrast to the storm that rumbled inside her chest. Naomi's phone buzzed in her hand. A message from her closest friend, Aisha, flashed on the screen. Aisha, don't forget to breathe. You've got this. They're lucky to hear from you. Naomi smiled at the message, grateful for the encouragement. Aisha had always been her biggest cheerleader, especially during those moments when self-doubt threatened to creep in. It wasn't that Naomi doubted her abilities. She knew she was a good doctor, an excellent one, in fact. But stepping onto a stage in front of an audience filled with some of the most influential people in the healthcare industry was a different kind of pressure. It wasn't just about sharing facts and data. It was about delivering a message that could move people to action. Naomi. Thanks, Aisha. I'll call you later. Just trying to keep calm before the flight. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and looked around the bustling terminal. Families with young children hurried past. Business travelers paced as they spoke into their earpieces, and weary passengers sank into seats, staring blankly at their phones. It was a scene she'd witnessed countless times before, but today, the atmosphere felt charged. Maybe it was just her nerves, or maybe it was the anticipation of what awaited her in New York. Naomi wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. She could see it in the way other travelers fidgeted with their luggage, checked their boarding passes, and glanced anxiously at the flight information screens. There was a collective tension in the air, a sense that everyone was in a rush to get somewhere important. The boarding announcement for her flight crackled over the speakers, snapping her back to the present. She gathered her things and joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the gate. Naomi was flying economy, as she usually did. While she could afford to splurge on business class if she wanted to, she preferred to travel simply. It was a small act of humility that kept her grounded. As the line slowly advanced, Naomi felt her heart rate quicken. She wasn't sure if it was excitement or anxiety, maybe both. Either way, she was ready to get on the plane, settle into her seat, and review her notes one last time before the whirlwind of the conference swept her up. Naomi boarded the plane with a polite smile for the flight attendant who greeted her at the door. The narrow aisle of the plane felt even tighter with the crush of passengers moving to find their seats. Naomi maneuvered through the crowded space, her carry-on bag bumping slightly against the seats as she made her way toward the back of the economy section. She had been assigned a middle seat, which wasn't ideal, but she didn't mind. This flight was only a couple of hours long, and she intended to spend most of it reviewing her notes for the keynote speech. As she reached her row, Naomi lifted her bag into the overhead compartment with ease and slid into her seat. The window seat was already occupied by a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s. Her headphones were already in place as she scrolled through her phone. The aisle seat, however, was still empty. Naomi settled in, pulling out her tablet from her bag. She turned it on and opened her presentation notes, ready to fine-tune the talking points she had been preparing for months. But just as she began reading the first few lines, she felt a presence hovering near her. She glanced up to see a tall, middle-aged man standing in the aisle, holding a boarding pass in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. His silver-gray hair was slicked back, and he wore a tailored suit that practically screamed wealth and self-importance. His sharp blue eyes flicked from his boarding pass to the seat number overhead, and then to Naomi. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice sharp and impatient. He gestured toward the aisle seat next to her. Naomi quickly stood up, allowing the man to pass. "Of course," she said, offering a polite smile. The man didn't acknowledge her, instead letting out a soft sigh as he squeezed past her and into the aisle seat. Naomi sat back down, adjusting her seatbelt and trying to focus on her tablet. She could already feel the tension radiating from the man beside her. He fidgeted in his seat, letting out another audible sigh as he settled in. "These flights," the man muttered under his breath, though it was loud enough for Naomi to hear. "They've really gone downhill." Naomi resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She had encountered passengers like this before, people who believed they were entitled to something better, even in economy class. She had learned to ignore them, focusing on her work instead of engaging in unnecessary conversations. But something about the man's tone made it hard to tune him out. There was a layer of disdain in his voice, one that felt uncomfortably familiar. As the plane began to fill with the last of the passengers, the man continued to shift in his seat, his irritation becoming more palpable with each passing minute. Naomi tried to keep her focus on her notes, but she couldn't help but feel the growing discomfort next to her. Finally, the man spoke again, this time turning slightly toward her. "You people," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "always act like you're entitled to everything." Naomi froze, her fingers tightening around the edges of her tablet. She had heard comments like that before, remarks that were deliberately vague but laced with a venomous intent. You people. It was a phrase that never meant anything good, and Naomi knew exactly what he meant by it. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she remained calm, refusing to give him the reaction he was clearly trying to provoke. "I'm not sure what you mean by that," Naomi said evenly, not looking up from her tablet. "I'm just sitting here, like everyone else." The man scoffed, rolling his eyes as if her response had confirmed everything he already believed. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "People like you don't belong in places like this. Economy class is bad enough without having to deal with—" Before he could finish his sentence, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, sir. Is there a problem here?" Both Naomi and the man turned in unison to see a tall black man standing in the aisle, leaning slightly over the back of Naomi's seat. His expression was calm but firm, and his presence immediately commanded attention. He was broad-shouldered and muscular, his posture relaxed but authoritative. Naomi could see a hint of military precision in the way he carried himself, like someone who was used to stepping into tense situations and diffusing them before they escalated. "I asked if there's a problem," the man repeated, his eyes fixed on Naomi's seatmate. The middle-aged man glared at the newcomer, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Mind your business," he snapped, turning back toward the window as if hoping the matter would end there. But the newcomer wasn't backing down. His tone remained calm but firm. "It is my business when someone's being disrespected for no reason," he said. "Everyone on this plane deserves to be treated with respect." Naomi felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She hadn't asked for help, but in that moment, she was glad someone had spoken up. The tension in the air was thick, and she could feel her pulse quicken. But she had dealt with men like her seatmate before, men who believed their privilege gave them the right to belittle others. Her seatmate, however, wasn't done. His face twisted in anger, his fingers gripping the armrest tightly. "People like her," he spat, his voice lowering to a venomous whisper, "think they can just take up space wherever they want." Naomi's heart raced. She had heard this kind of venom before, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. She was torn between wanting to confront him and wanting to avoid any further confrontation. But the man in the aisle, the man who had stepped in so calmly, seemed to sense her hesitation. "You've said enough," the man in the aisle said firmly, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Walk away now before this gets any worse for you." Her seatmate glared up at him, his fist tightening for a brief moment. But as he looked around, realizing that others were watching, his resolve seemed to waver. With a muttered curse under his breath, he turned away, sinking into his seat and staring out the window. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, but it shifted slightly, the immediate threat of confrontation seemingly averted. Naomi glanced up at the man in the aisle, offering him a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. The man gave her a nod in return. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm just doing what's right." He stepped back into his seat, a row behind her, but Naomi could still feel his presence, steady, watchful. It was a strange feeling knowing that someone had intervened on her behalf. She wasn't used to that. Most of the time, she fought her own battles, carrying the weight of each encounter with quiet strength. But this time, she wasn't alone. As the plane taxied down the runway, Naomi tried to focus on her notes again, but her mind kept drifting back to the man beside her and the man behind her. The hostility she had faced was nothing new, but the intervention had been, and while it had diffused the situation, Naomi knew that the flight wasn't over yet. There was still a long way to go. As the plane ascended into the clear evening sky, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, providing a low, constant background noise. Naomi sat in her seat, her tablet still open in her lap, but her mind was far from the notes for her speech. The confrontation with the man beside her, Ethan Green, had stirred something deeper than anger or frustration. It had triggered a flood of memories, reminders of the countless times she had been forced to endure slights, condescension, and outright hostility simply because of who she was. Naomi had grown used to the subtle ways people revealed their biases, the way they would say "you people" with a sneer, or how they would ask her to explain her qualifications in a tone that suggested they didn't believe she belonged. The man next to her had spoken with the same arrogance, the same sense of superiority that she had encountered throughout her life. It never got easier. She leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly as she tried to let go of the tension. But her thoughts refused to settle. Instead, they pulled her back, drifting into the past. Naomi was in her first year of medical school, standing in the anatomy lab. The smell of formaldehyde filled the air as she stood over the cadaver, scalpel in hand, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She had worked her entire life to get to this point, pushing through countless obstacles to earn her place at one of the country's top medical schools. But despite her academic achievements, despite the hours she had spent studying, Naomi still felt like she was walking on a tightrope. Her classmates surrounded her, their voices low as they discussed the day's dissection. Naomi was the only black woman in her class, a fact that had been painfully clear from the moment she had walked into orientation. She had known going in that the path ahead would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated just how isolating it would feel. She had hoped that in the world of medicine she would be judged solely on her abilities and intellect. But that wasn't how things worked. She remembered the first time her anatomy professor, Dr. Matthews, had singled her out in front of the class. They were reviewing skeletal structures, and Naomi had answered a question about the bones of the hand with confidence, naming each carpal and metacarpal correctly. But Dr. Matthews had narrowed his eyes at her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Are you sure about that, Miss Davis?" he had asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Naomi had paused, glancing down at the bones in her hands. She had been sure, completely sure, but his tone had made her doubt herself. When she hesitated, Dr. Matthews had turned to one of her white male classmates. "What do you think, Mr. Sinclair?" he asked. Brian Sinclair had answered with the exact same response Naomi had given, but Dr. Matthews had nodded approvingly, as though Sinclair's confirmation was what had validated the answer. Naomi had felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she had kept her head down, refusing to let it show. It wasn't worth the fight, not then. It wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout her time in medical school, Naomi had been subjected to the same treatment over and over again. Professors would question her answers even when they were correct. Patients would assume she was a nurse or an assistant, never the doctor. Colleagues would make offhand comments about her being the diversity hire, as though her presence in the room was some kind of token gesture. And through it all, Naomi had learned to remain calm, to keep her emotions in check. She couldn't afford to get angry. She couldn't afford to show frustration. Any sign of emotion would be seen as confirmation that she didn't belong, that she was too emotional, too sensitive, too unprofessional. So, she smiled politely and worked twice as hard. determined to prove them all wrong. But the weight of it had been crushing. Naomi blinked, pulling herself out of the memory. She glanced out the small airplane window, the endless stretch of sky fading into twilight. The steady rhythm of the engines was oddly soothing, but her mind was still racing. The man beside her had fallen silent, seemingly content to stare out the window, his earlier hostility simmering just beneath the surface. She stole a glance at the man behind her, Michael Johnson, the one who had come to her defense. He sat quietly, his broad frame relaxed as he scrolled through something on his phone. Naomi felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't often that someone stepped in when these moments of tension arose. Most people preferred to stay silent to avoid confrontation at all costs. But Michael hadn't hesitated. He had seen the situation for what it was and had chosen to act. She hadn't asked for his help, but she was thankful for it. Naomi knew she wasn't alone in these experiences. There were countless other black women, other women of color, who faced the same struggles in their professional and personal lives. They, too, had learned to navigate a world that constantly questioned their worth, and yet every time it happened, it stung. No matter how much success she achieved, no matter how many degrees or accolades she earned, there would always be someone like Ethan, someone who believed she didn't belong. Her thoughts shifted to her upcoming keynote speech. She had planned to talk about healthcare disparities, about the ways in which systemic racism impacted access to care and the quality of treatment for marginalized communities. But now, after everything that had happened on the plane, Naomi wondered if she needed to go deeper. Maybe it wasn't enough to talk about statistics and policy changes. Maybe she needed to share the personal lived experience of racism, both in healthcare and beyond. Would they listen? Would they understand? Naomi wasn't sure, but what she did know was that she couldn't stay silent any longer. The weight of her experiences, the anger and frustration she had carried for so long, was bubbling up to the surface. It was time to speak the truth, even if it made people uncomfortable. Especially if it makes people uncomfortable. The plane continued its journey through the sky, cutting through the dusk like a silent arrow. Naomi's thoughts were still swirling, but she had made a decision. Her speech would change. It wouldn't just be about disparities in healthcare anymore. It would be about the systemic racism that underpinned those disparities. It would be about the lived experiences that couldn't be captured in statistics or graphs. She would tell the truth, her truth, no matter how difficult it was for the audience to hear. As she glanced down at her notes again, the seatbelt sign dinged on overhead, signaling the beginning of the plane's descent into New York. The flight attendants moved quickly, preparing the cabin for landing, and passengers around her began to stir, packing away their devices and stretching in their seats. Naomi took a deep breath, bracing herself for the landing and everything that would follow. Beside her, Ethan shifted in his seat again, his irritation palpable. Though he hadn't spoken since the earlier confrontation, Naomi could feel the tension radiating from him like a toxic cloud. She had hoped that the silence meant the situation had been resolved, but something told her that Ethan wasn't the type to let things go easily. As if on cue, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Naomi to hear, "People like her always think they deserve something more." Naomi's heart skipped a beat, her grip tightening on the armrest. She turned slowly to face him, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Excuse me?" Ethan met her gaze, his blue eyes cold and condescending. "You heard me," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You people think you can just waltz into spaces that don't belong to you, that you can demand respect, demand attention, like the world owes you something." Naomi felt a rush of heat rise in her chest, her pulse quickening with anger. She had dealt with plenty of men like Ethan in her life, men who believed their privilege entitled them to everything, and that anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of worth was somehow inferior. But this was blatant. This was hate, plain and simple. "I've worked hard for everything I have," Naomi said, her voice steady but firm. "I've earned my place here just like anyone else." Ethan let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You've earned it?" "Right, because people like you are just given everything, aren't you? Special treatment, special programs, quotas, all to make sure you can take up space that you don't deserve." Naomi's jaw tightened. She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears, the anger and frustration she had been holding back threatening to spill over. But she had learned long ago that getting angry wouldn't solve anything. Men like Ethan thrived on provoking a reaction. They wanted to see her lose control, to confirm their own biases about her. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But before she could respond, Michael's voice rang out from behind her once again, cutting through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." Naomi turned to see Michael leaning forward, his expression calm but deadly serious. His eyes were locked on Ethan, his posture radiating quiet authority. Ethan turned toward Michael, his face twisting in anger. "Oh, what now?" he spat. "You think you're going to come to her rescue again? You people always stick together, don't you? Pathetic." Naomi's heart clenched at the venom in his voice, but Michael didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lose his composure. Instead, he spoke with a calm that was almost unnerving. "This is your last chance to shut your mouth and walk away," Michael said, his voice low but commanding, "because if you don't, things are going to get a lot worse for you." For a moment, Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, and Naomi thought he might lash out. But as he looked around, seeing the flight attendants watching and the passengers nearby who were now paying attention, his resolve seemed to waver. With a final sneer, Ethan turned away, muttering something under his breath as he stared out the window. The tension in the air didn't completely dissipate, but the immediate threat of confrontation had passed. Naomi exhaled, her body releasing the tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She glanced back at Michael, who met her gaze with a nod of understanding. "You okay?" Michael asked quietly. Naomi nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "Yeah," she said softly. "Thanks." Michael leaned back in his seat, his expression softening. "Anytime." As the plane touched down on the runway and taxied toward the gate, Naomi felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The encounter with Ethan had drained her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she also felt a sense of resolve strengthening inside her. This was why her speech was so important. This was why she couldn't hold back. Because men like Ethan Green weren't just on this plane. They were in hospitals and clinics and boardrooms making decisions that affected the lives of millions. And they needed to be confronted. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to stand, gathering their belongings from the overhead bins. Naomi stayed in her seat for a moment longer, taking a deep breath and centering herself. The flight was over, but the battle wasn't. Not by a long shot. The plane jerked slightly as it made contact with the runway, the familiar hum of the engines shifting into a lower gear as it slowed to a stop. Naomi released the armrest she had been gripping without realizing it, letting out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The brief, turbulent encounter with Ethan had left her drained but determined. As the cabin lights flickered on and passengers around her began to rise, reaching for their luggage, she stayed seated for a moment, collecting herself. Her hands trembled slightly, a physical manifestation of the emotional weight she had been carrying since the beginning of the flight. Ethan, true to form, shot up from his seat as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off. He was quick to grab his expensive leather briefcase from the overhead bin, his movements abrupt and laced with impatience. Naomi could feel his presence even though she wasn't looking at him directly, the heat of his hostility still palpable. She kept her eyes on her bag under the seat, determined to avoid further interaction, but she knew the storm wasn't completely over. As Ethan struggled to maneuver his way into the aisle, his tall frame blocking other passengers, He muttered something under his breath. Naomi caught a few of the words, ridiculous and entitled, followed by a low grumble of frustration. Other passengers, weary from the long flight, glanced at him with irritation as he delayed their exit. One man behind him spoke up. "Can we move along, please?" the man asked, his tone firm but polite. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he stood his ground, taking his time as if to exert his power over the moment, delaying everyone else's departure from the plane. Naomi sighed inwardly, realizing that his behavior extended beyond simple prejudice. It was about control, about making sure that everyone around him knew he was the one who held power in any given situation. She adjusted her bag and stood when the aisle cleared enough for her to gather her things. The physical act of standing felt like a small victory. Leaving the confined space where the tension had been boiling was a relief, but she knew the day was far from over. As she reached up to pull her suitcase from the overhead bin, she felt the presence behind her once more. "Let me get that for you." Michael's voice came from behind her, steady and calm. He reached up and retrieved her bag with ease, handing it to her with a small smile. "Thanks," Naomi said, her voice quiet but sincere. Michael nodded and stepped aside, allowing her to exit the row. Together they moved down the narrow aisle, the cool air of the plane's cabin a small respite from the emotional heat of the flight. As they walked toward the exit, Naomi found herself glancing toward the front of the plane where Ethan had already disappeared down the jet bridge. "He's not worth your time," Michael said quietly, as if reading her mind. "Guys like him, they rely on you reacting, getting upset. They thrive on it." Naomi nodded, her throat tightening as she thought about the truth of his words. "I know," she said softly, "but it's hard not to let it get to you." "It's designed to get to you," Michael replied. "But you handled it. That's what matters." As they stepped out into the jet bridge, Naomi felt a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. Michael had intervened when she hadn't asked for it, and while she was thankful, she also felt a sense of frustration. It wasn't that she couldn't handle it. It was that she shouldn't have had to. Men like Ethan were everywhere, and every time someone like her was forced to confront them, it chipped away at her sense of peace. The cool air of JFK International Airport's terminal greeted them as they stepped out of the jet bridge. Naomi could hear the familiar sounds of the bustling airport, the distant rumble of announcements over the loudspeaker, the hum of conversations, the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases. But amid the chaos, she felt a strange stillness, as though the weight of the past few hours hadn't quite left her. They walked in silence toward baggage claim, the crowd around them a blur of hurried passengers. Naomi's mind raced with everything that had happened on the flight, but even more so with what was ahead of her. The conference loomed large in her mind, a towering event that felt like both a milestone and a burden. Her keynote speech was scheduled for the following afternoon, and though she had prepared extensively, she now knew that her original speech wasn't enough. The personal, lived experiences of racism, the ones she had been too polite to include in her original draft, needed to be spoken aloud. This wasn't just about statistics or healthcare disparities on paper. It was about people like her, like the patients she had treated who faced constant, unrelenting discrimination. "Your speech tomorrow," Michael said, breaking the silence. "I'm guessing you're going to talk about more than just healthcare statistics now." Naomi glanced at him, surprised. "How did you know?" Michael shrugged. "It's in your eyes. That fight back there, it's part of a bigger story, and I get the feeling you're the kind of person who doesn't let those stories go untold." Naomi smiled faintly. He was right. There was no way she could stand on that stage tomorrow and deliver the speech she had originally written. She had to talk about what had happened today, not just with Ethan, but with the system that allowed people like him to thrive. "I can't avoid it," she admitted. "Not anymore." Good, Michael said. They need to hear it, and I've got a feeling you're the right person to make them listen. They reached the baggage claim area, and Naomi scanned the carousel for her suitcase. As the conveyor belt whirred to life, bags began to tumble onto the rotating belt, and she spotted her suitcase, a medium-sized black roller bag marked with a bright yellow luggage tag. She moved forward to retrieve it, but as she reached for the handle, her body tensed. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. Ethan was standing by one of the pillars near the baggage claim, his phone pressed to his ear, his eyes scanning the crowd. When their gazes met, Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to remind her that the confrontation wasn't over. He hadn't forgotten what had happened on the plane, and it was clear he wasn't done with whatever point he had been trying to make. Her hand tightened around the handle of her suitcase as she pulled it off the belt, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. "Do you want me to stick around?" Michael asked quietly, his eyes following her gaze toward Ethan. Naomi hesitated, but then nodded. "Yeah," she said, "just in case." Michael gave her a reassuring look, stepping closer to her side as they moved toward the exit. They walked in silence, but Naomi could feel Ethan's gaze on her, like a shadow that refused to leave. She hated that he had this effect on her, that his words had burrowed under her skin, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. But she also knew that she couldn't let him win. She had fought too hard to get to where she was, and men like Ethan didn't get to decide her worth. As they neared the exit, Naomi glanced back one last time, half expecting Ethan to follow them, but to her relief he was still standing by the pillar, his phone pressed to his ear, though his eyes never left her. "Let's get out of here," Naomi said, her voice firm. Together they stepped out into the cool New York evening, the bustle of taxis and buses competing for space in the crowded lanes. The air felt refreshing against Naomi's skin, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the airport. "You're going to be fine," Michael said as they reached the curb. "You've got a lot on your plate right now, but you've also got a lot of strength." Naomi nodded, taking in his words. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle whatever came her way, but today had been a reminder that even the strongest people needed support sometimes. She hadn't asked for Michael's help, but she was grateful he had offered it. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer now. "Really?" Michael gave her a small smile. "No problem. You've got my number if you need anything while you're in the city." As they parted ways, Naomi felt a wave of calm wash over her. The next 24 hours would be critical, not just for her career, but for the message she was about to deliver. She had a speech to rewrite, and this time she wouldn't hold back. She climbed into a waiting cab, giving the driver the address of her hotel. As the cab merged into the chaotic flow of New York City traffic, Naomi stared out the window. Her mind was already turning toward the speech. She would speak her truth, and she would do it with the strength and resolve she had carried with her for so long. But before she could think too deeply about it, her phone buzzed with a message from Aisha. "Aisha, how's NY? You good?" Naomi typed a quick response. "Naomi, had a rough flight, but I'm good. I've got some work to do before tomorrow." Aisha's reply came almost instantly. "Aisha, you've got this, Naomi. Just remember who you are and why you're doing this. Nobody can take that from you." Naomi smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Aisha was right. No one could take this from her. She had earned her place, and tomorrow she would stand on that stage and make sure everyone in that room knew it. By the time Naomi reached her hotel, the adrenaline from the flight had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. The sleek modern lobby of the hotel was a blur as she made her way to the front desk, checking in quickly before heading up to her room. The doors slid open to reveal a spacious, minimalist room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the New York City skyline. Normally, Naomi would have taken a moment to appreciate the beauty of it all, the twinkling lights of the city, the sheer scale of it. But tonight, her mind was elsewhere. She set her suitcase down near the door and collapsed onto the plush armchair by the window, letting out a long, tired sigh. The soft glow of the city lights bathed the room in a warm, calming light, but it did little to soothe the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. Naomi pulled out her tablet and opened her notes for the keynote speech. The original draft was clean, polished, and packed with facts and statistics about healthcare disparities. It was a speech that would have impressed any audience, filled with hard data and recommendations for policy change. But now, after what had happened on the flight, it felt hollow. The statistics were important, but they didn't tell the whole story. They didn't capture the lived experiences of people like her, people who had been marginalized and dismissed at every turn, people who had been told over and over again that they didn't belong. Naomi's fingers hovered over the screen as she stared at the text. The urge to rewrite the entire speech was overwhelming, but she didn't know where to start. How could she convey the complexity of what she had experienced, what so many others had experienced, without it sounding like an emotional rant? She needed to strike the right balance. It had to be personal, but it also had to be professional. She needed the audience to listen, not just to hear her words, but to truly understand them. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Michael. "Michael, how's the speech coming along?" Naomi smiled, typing out a quick reply. "Naomi." Trying to figure out how to make them listen without making them uncomfortable. Michael's response came almost immediately. "Michael, maybe they need to be uncomfortable. The truth isn't always easy to hear." Naomi stared at the message, letting his words sink in. He was right. The truth wasn't always easy to hear, but that didn't mean it shouldn't be said. She couldn't sugarcoat the reality of systemic racism just to make the audience feel comfortable. They needed to understand the depth of the problem, the pain it caused, and the lives it destroyed. With renewed determination, Naomi sat up straight, pulling her tablet onto her lap. She opened a new document and began typing, her fingers flying across the screen as she rewrote the speech from scratch. This time, she wouldn't hold back. She would tell the truth, the whole truth. The soft hum of the hotel air conditioning filled the quiet room as Naomi's fingers moved rapidly across the screen of her tablet. Her mind raced to translate years of lived experience and professional knowledge into words that would resonate, not just with the minds of those at the conference, but with their hearts. The speech had to strike the right balance between facts and personal truths, something Naomi had struggled with before. But now, after what she'd just been through, the need to connect these two worlds felt even more urgent. Her eyes scanned over her opening lines. Today, we will discuss healthcare disparities in marginalized communities, but before we dive into statistics and charts, I want to talk about something that isn't always captured by data: the lived experience, the daily microaggressions, the quiet yet destructive assumptions, and the systemic racism that people like me face, whether we're patients or physicians. Naomi paused, rereading her words. They felt right. They captured the duality she had lived with, straddling two worlds, one where she was a doctor who fought for others, and another where she was a black woman constantly fighting for her own legitimacy. As she stared at the screen, she found herself rewriting sections again and again, fine-tuning her message. Each sentence was a careful calculation. How much should she reveal? Would the audience be open to hearing this? But there was no time for second-guessing now. Naomi leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She glanced out of the hotel's window, watching as the lights of New York City flickered like a pulse beneath the deepening night sky. The sprawling metropolis stretched out before her, vast and indifferent to the emotional turmoil she was feeling. She had never been one to shy away from the spotlight, but the stakes now felt different, bigger. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Another message from Aisha. Aisha, still awake? You know you should rest before the big day. Naomi smiled softly, her fingers tapping a quick reply. Naomi, I know, but you know me. I can't rest until it's perfect. Aisha, you always say that, but you don't need perfection, Naomi. You just need to be yourself. That's more than enough. Naomi read the message twice, letting the warmth of Aisha's words sink in. It was easy to get caught up in the details, to lose sight of what truly mattered. Aisha was right. This speech wasn't about presenting some flawless narrative. It was about telling the truth. Her truth. The truth is that too many people were afraid to speak out loud. A knock on the door jolted Naomi from her thoughts. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was already after 10 p.m. Who could it be? She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should ignore it, but curiosity got the better of her. She walked over to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Michael. Naomi opened the door, surprised to see him standing there with a small paper bag in his hand. Sorry to drop by unannounced, Michael said, giving her an apologetic smile. I know it's late, but I thought you could use a little boost. Naomi raised an eyebrow as she glanced at the bag. What's in the bag? Michael grinned, holding it up. Some comfort food. Well, as close to comfort food as I could find this late at night. Cookies and coffee. Figured you'd still be working. Naomi couldn't help but laugh, a wave of gratitude washing over her. You know me too well. Mind if I come in for a few minutes? Michael asked, his tone casual, though Naomi could see the concern in his eyes. Sure, Naomi said, stepping aside to let him in. Michael entered the room, setting the bag down on the small table near the window. He pulled out 2 large coffee cups and a container of chocolate chip cookies. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, mingling with the crisp night air that wafted in from the open window. Naomi sank back into her chair as Michael handed her a cup of coffee. You didn't have to do this, you know, she said, taking a sip and feeling the warmth spread through her chest. I know, Michael said, sitting down across from her. But I figured you could use some company before the big day. You've got a lot on your mind. Naomi nodded, her eyes drifting to the tablet on the table. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to get all of this right. I keep rewriting parts of it, trying to decide how much I should say. Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. What are you worried about, the content or how people will react? Naomi sighed. Both, I guess. I mean, I want to tell the truth. The whole truth. But I'm worried about how it'll be received. You've seen how some people react when we talk about race, especially in professional settings. They either shut down or get defensive. Michael nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It's not easy, but you know this already. It's not about making them comfortable. The truth is uncomfortable, but that's why it needs to be said. Naomi smiled faintly. You sound like Aisha. She keeps telling me not to overthink it, to just be myself. She's right, Michael said, giving her a warm smile. You've got a powerful voice, Naomi, and tomorrow you'll have the chance to use it in a way that could really make a difference. Don't let people like Ethan silence you. Hearing Ethan's name sent a flicker of anger through Naomi, but she quickly pushed it aside. I won't, she said firmly. It's hard, you know. You face this stuff your whole life, and no matter how many times you confront it, it still hits you. I get it, Michael said quietly. But the fact that you keep confronting it, that you haven't let it break you, that's what makes you strong. People need to see that. They need to hear what you have to say. Naomi looked into Michael's eyes. feeling a surge of gratitude for his presence. He had been there on the plane, and now, here he was again, offering her encouragement when she needed it most. "I appreciate that," Naomi said softly. "And I appreciate you stepping in earlier today. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "You would have handled it," Michael said with a shrug. "But I'm glad I was there. People like Ethan need to be called out. They can't just keep getting away with it." Naomi nodded, her thoughts drifting back to Ethan. She wondered if he was still lurking somewhere in the city, nursing his wounded pride. But that wasn't her concern anymore. Tomorrow, she had a bigger task ahead of her, delivering a speech that could spark real change. "Do you mind if I ask something?" Michael said, his tone shifted slightly. "Go ahead," Naomi replied. "Why do you feel like you have to hold back?" Michael asked, his eyes searching hers. "I mean, it seems like you've got this incredible story to tell, something that could really make people listen. So why not just let it all out?" Naomi hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip as she considered his question. I guess I'm afraid that if I'm too honest, too raw, people will tune me out. They'll write me off as just another angry black woman with a chip on her shoulder." Michael shook his head, his expression serious. "If they do that, it's because they're not ready to face the truth. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't speak it. You've earned the right to be on that stage, Naomi. You've earned the right to tell your story. And if they can't handle it, that's on them, not you." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat as his words sank in. He was right. She had earned her place. She had spent her entire life proving herself, fighting for every inch of respect in a world that constantly tried to undermine her. Tomorrow was her chance to use that platform, to tell her truth without fear or hesitation. "You're right," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about it all wrong. I've been so focused on making sure everyone's comfortable that I forgot why I'm doing this in the first place." Michael smiled softly. "Exactly. You're doing this for you, for the people you represent, and for the change you want to see. That's what matters." Naomi nodded, a sense of clarity washing over her. For the first time since she had boarded the plane, the tension in her chest eased, replaced by quiet determination. "I needed to hear that," Naomi admitted, setting her coffee cup down on the table. "Thank you." Michael stood, reaching for his jacket. "Anytime. Now, I should let you get some sleep. You've got a big day tomorrow." Naomi walked him to the door, feeling lighter than she had all evening. "Thanks again for everything, Michael." "Don't mention it," he said with a grin. "You've got this." As Michael left, Naomi closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, letting out a long breath. She glanced at her tablet, the speech still waiting for her to finish it, but she no longer felt the need to agonize over every word. She knew what she needed to say, and now she knew how to say it. Naomi returned to the armchair by the window, gazing out at the sprawling city below. Tomorrow would be a challenge, but she was ready. She had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this, moments where the truth needed to be spoken, no matter how uncomfortable it made people feel. She opened her tablet again, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she began typing the final words of her speech. Change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from courage. And today I'm standing here, not because I'm comfortable, but because I refuse to be silent any longer. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city as Naomi stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room, adjusting the lapel of her navy blue blazer. The reflection staring back at her was calm, poised, and ready, at least on the outside. Inside, her nerves were still firing, her heart beating a little faster than usual. But the clarity she had gained the night before helped her push past anxiety. This was her day, her moment. The keynote speech at the annual medical conference was a prestigious honor, one that Naomi had been working toward for years. She had spent her career advocating for change, highlighting the healthcare disparities that disproportionately affected Black and brown communities. But today wasn't just about numbers and statistics. It was about speaking truth to power. Naomi's phone buzzed on the counter beside her, and she glanced down to see a message from Aisha. Aisha, I know today's the big day. I just want to remind you that you've already won. Just by standing on that stage and telling your truth, you've already won. Go kill it, sis. Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Aisha had been there for her through every trial and triumph, always reminding her of her strength. Today would be no different. As she slipped on her shoes and gathered her notes, Naomi felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once more. She had rewritten her speech late into the night, infusing it with personal anecdotes and hard truths that she knew might make some people uncomfortable. But that was the point. She wasn't here to placate anyone. She was here to speak for those who had been ignored for far too long. The conference was being held in a grand hotel ballroom downtown, and as Naomi arrived, she could see attendees milling about, checking in at the registration desk and collecting their name tags. Doctors, researchers, and healthcare leaders from across the country were gathered here, their conversations buzzing with excitement and anticipation. Naomi walked through the lobby, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. She spotted Dr. James Thompson, one of her mentors from medical school, speaking with a group of colleagues. He caught her eye and gave her a warm smile, nodding in approval. It was a small gesture, but it gave Naomi a boost of confidence. Dr. Thompson had always believed in her, even when others had doubted her abilities. As she approached the registration desk, a young woman with a clipboard greeted her with a bright smile. "Dr. Davis, we're so excited to have you here today," the woman said. "You're up in about an hour, but if you'd like to sit in the green room to prepare, I can show you the way." Naomi nodded, grateful for the chance to gather her thoughts before stepping onto the stage. "That would be great, thank you." The woman led Naomi through a series of hallways to a small, quiet room off the main conference hall. Inside, there was a comfortable chair, a small table with bottled water, and a mirror on the wall. It was a simple, calming space, and Naomi appreciated solitude. She sat down, placing her notes on the table in front of her, though she barely glanced at them. She had internalized every word of her speech by now, each sentence a reflection of her truth. But as she sat there, alone with her thoughts, the weight of what she was about to do began to sink in. This wasn't just another presentation. This was her chance to speak on behalf of countless people whose voices had been silenced. She was standing on the shoulders of her ancestors, of those who had fought for justice and equality long before her. The pressure was immense, but so was the opportunity. Naomi closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she centered herself. She thought about her parents, who had sacrificed so much to ensure she had every opportunity in life. She thought about the patients she had treated, whose stories had fueled her passion for change. And she thought about the little girl she had once been, the one who had dreamed of becoming a doctor, even when the world told her it wasn't possible. This moment was for all of them. The door to the green room opened, and the young woman with the clipboard peeked in. "Dr. Davis, we're ready for you now." Naomi stood smoothing down her blazer as she followed the woman through the hallways to the backstage area. She could hear the low murmur of the audience, their conversations blending into a single hum of anticipation. The moderator was on stage, introducing her, listing her accomplishments and the impact of her work. But Naomi barely registered the words. Her focus was entirely on the message she was about to deliver. As the moderator finished, the applause began and Naomi stepped out from behind the curtain. The bright stage lights momentarily blinded her, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw the sea of faces before her. Hundreds of people, all waiting to hear what she had to say. Naomi walked to the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, glancing down at her notes one last time before looking up at the audience. This was it. She had one shot to make them listen. Naomi stood at the podium, her fingers gripping the edges as she scanned the sea of faces before her. The ballroom was filled with some of the most influential people in healthcare. Doctors, researchers, policymakers, all waiting to hear what she had to say. The weight of their expectations hung in the air, but Naomi had long since let go of the need to impress. She wasn't here to seek their approval. She was here to tell the truth. The applause from her introduction faded into a hushed anticipation, and Naomi cleared her throat, allowing the silence to settle for a brief moment before she began. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "Today, we're here to talk about healthcare disparities, an issue that has plagued our system for far too long. But before we dive into data and statistics, I want to start with a story. My story." Naomi paused, letting her words sink in. She could see the subtle shifts in body language among the audience, some leaning forward, intrigued by her personal approach, while others crossed their arms, waiting for the real presentation to begin. She had expected this. She knew not everyone would be eager to hear about the personal impact of systemic racism in healthcare, but that was exactly why she needed to tell it. "I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in North Carolina," Naomi continued. "My parents worked hard to provide for me and my siblings, but we didn't have access to the best health care. In fact, we didn't have regular access to health care at all. We didn't have insurance, and we couldn't afford regular doctor visits. We went to the emergency room when things got bad, hoping that we wouldn't be turned away." She glanced around the room, watching as the expressions on some of the faces softened. These were experiences that many of the people in the room had never faced, experiences that were foreign to them, despite being all too common for millions of Americans. "But it wasn't just about access," Naomi said, her voice growing firmer. "It was about the way we were treated when we finally did seek care. The assumptions doctors made about us, about our intelligence, our income, our ability to understand medical jargon. We were often dismissed, our symptoms minimized, our concerns ignored. This is something that communities of color experience every day, and it's part of a larger problem, one that runs deep within the very system we're all a part of." She could see a few nods in the audience, but there were others who remained stoic, their expressions unreadable. Naomi took a deep breath, bracing herself for the next part. This was where the speech would get personal, where the statistics and data would give way to the raw, unfiltered truth of her own experience. "Fast forward to when I became a doctor," Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. "I thought that once I earned that white coat, once I had those letters after my name, the world would see me differently. I thought that the prejudice I had experienced growing up would disappear. But I was wrong. It only changed. It became more subtle, more insidious." A murmur rippled through the room, and Naomi pressed on, refusing to lose momentum. "I've been questioned, dismissed, and condescended to by colleagues who assumed that I wasn't as competent as they were, simply because of the color of my skin. I've had patients refuse to let me treat them because they didn't believe a black woman could be a real doctor. I've been told I'm too aggressive when I speak up in meetings, and I've been passed over for opportunities that were given to less qualified peers." Naomi could feel the tension in the room rising. This wasn't just a presentation on healthcare disparities anymore. It was a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth of racism in the medical field. And she wasn't going to hold back. "I'm not here to play the victim," Naomi said, her tone sharpening. "I'm here to speak for every black woman, every person of color who has been made to feel small, who has been told, explicitly or implicitly, that they don't belong. I'm here to speak for the patients who have been ignored, whose pain has been dismissed because their doctors didn't believe them. I'm here to demand that we, as healthcare professionals, do better." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the audience. The room was eerily quiet now, the hum of murmured conversations replaced by a palpable stillness. "We talk about healthcare disparities as if they're just numbers on a spreadsheet," Naomi continued. "But behind every statistic is a human being, a person whose life has been shaped by the systemic racism that pervades our institutions. And if we don't confront that racism head-on, if we don't acknowledge how deeply it's embedded in our system, then we'll never be able to truly address the disparities that we claim to care so much about." Naomi could feel the intensity of the moment building. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her voice remained steady, carrying the full weight of her conviction. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for change," she said, her voice rising with determination. "Real, lasting change that goes beyond platitudes and surface-level reforms. I'm asking for a healthcare system that sees the humanity in every patient, that recognizes the dignity of every doctor, regardless of their race or background. I'm asking for a world where we don't have to fight so hard just to be seen." She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the podium as she delivered her final words. "Change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from courage. And today, I'm standing here not because I'm comfortable, but because I refuse to be silent any longer." The silence that followed was deafening. For a few long, tense moments, no one in the audience moved. Naomi could feel her pulse racing, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had laid everything bare, told her truth without apology, and now she had to wait for the reaction. And then, slowly, the applause began. At first it was hesitant, a few claps here and there, but soon the sound swelled, filling the room with a rising crescendo of approval. People stood, their hands clapping loudly as they looked at Naomi with a mixture of admiration and respect. Naomi stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling with emotion. She had done it. She had spoken her truth, and they had listened. But even as the applause echoed around her, Naomi knew that this was only the beginning. The real work, the fight for change, was still ahead. And not everyone in that room was ready to hear what she had to say. As the applause faded, Naomi left the stage, her body still buzzing with the adrenaline of the speech. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, but also so powerful. She had told her story, her truth, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. But that feeling of freedom was short-lived as she stepped into the hallway behind the conference room. The buzz of the crowd still hummed in her ears, but now that she was alone, doubt began to creep in. She wondered how her words would be received once the applause died down. Would the people who had cheered her on during the speech be willing to act on the issues she had raised? Or would they return to their comfortable routines, leaving her message behind as just another talking point? Naomi walked down the long hallway toward the green room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The momentary high of the speech had faded, replaced by a heavy exhaustion. She wanted to sit down, to process everything that had just happened, but she knew that the conference attendees would soon want to speak with her. There would be handshakes and polite congratulations, but would there be real action? As she reached the green room, Naomi opened the door and sank into one of the plush chairs, her body slumping with the weight of the morning's events. She glanced at her phone and saw a message from Aisha. "Aisha, saw the live stream. You killed it. I'm so proud of you." They needed to hear that. Call me when you're free." Naomi smiled, her chest warming at the thought of her friend watching from afar. Aisha had always been her biggest supporter, the one person who truly understood the weight she carried. She quickly typed out a response. "Naomi. Thanks, Aisha. I'll call you later. Need to decompress a bit first." She set her phone down and leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling. The silence of the room was soothing, but her mind was anything but quiet. Flashes of the audience's reactions played in her head, the nods of agreement, the frowns of discomfort. There had been moments when she could see people shifting in their seats, their discomfort palpable, and while some of them had stood up and clapped, others had remained seated, arms crossed, their faces unreadable. A knock on the door pulled Naomi from her thoughts. She sat up, straightening her blazer as the door creaked open. It was Michael. "You okay?" he asked, stepping into the room with a concerned expression. Naomi smiled faintly, grateful for his presence. "Yeah, just processing everything." Michael nodded, leaning against the wall. "You were incredible out there. I mean, really. I don't think I've ever seen a room that quiet before." "Thanks," Naomi said, her voice soft. "I just hope it made an impact. It's one thing to get applause, but it's another to get people to actually do something." Michael pushed off the wall and walked over to sit across from her. "It did. Trust me. Some of those people needed to be shaken up. And you definitely shook them." Naomi chuckled softly. "I guess we'll see. I've been doing this work for so long, and sometimes it feels like we're moving in circles, like we're having the same conversations over and over again." Michael's gaze softened. "Yeah, I get that. But it's because of people like you that the conversation is even happening. It's slow, but change is happening." Naomi wanted to believe that, but the exhaustion was pulling her down, making it hard to hold on to hope. "I don't know," she admitted. I'm tired, Michael. I've been fighting for so long, and sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I push, nothing really changes." Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I hear you, but you're not fighting alone. There are more people in this with you than you realize." Naomi looked into his eyes, feeling the sincerity in his words. She nodded, but the weight of doubt still lingered. It wasn't that she didn't believe in the power of her words. It was that she knew how deeply ingrained the problems were. Systemic racism wasn't something that could be dismantled with a single speech, no matter how powerful. As they sat in silence, another knock came at the door. This time it was Dr. James Thompson, one of the senior doctors she had worked with during her residency. His presence was always calming, a reminder of the mentors who had believed in her when others hadn't. "Naomi," Dr. Thompson said warmly as he entered the room. "That was one hell of a speech. I knew you had it in you, but you exceeded even my expectations." Naomi smiled, standing up to greet him. "Thanks, Dr. Thompson. That means a lot coming from you." He nodded, his expression growing more serious. "I've seen a lot of talks at these conferences, but I've never seen someone address racism in healthcare so directly, so personally. You made them listen, Naomi." Naomi glanced at Michael, then back at Dr. Thompson. "I hope so. But I know there are people in that room who don't want to hear it, people who think I'm being too political." Dr. Thompson sighed, folding his arms. "That's always going to be the case. There are people who don't want to acknowledge that the system is broken because they benefit from it staying the way it is. But what you did today, that was brave. And it's going to open up doors for more conversations. Don't doubt that." Naomi nodded, though the heaviness in her chest remained. She knew that Dr. Thompson was right. Change didn't happen overnight. But she was tired of waiting for the world to catch up. "I just wish we didn't have to keep fighting so hard." Naomi said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thompson stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're not alone in this, Naomi. You've got a whole community behind you, and you've got people like me, people like Michael who are ready to stand with you. Naomi's eyes welled with emotion, but she quickly blinked it away, not wanting to break down in front of her colleagues. She was grateful for their support, but the exhaustion of carrying this burden of always being the one to speak up, to push for change, was overwhelming. Thanks, Dr. Thompson, Naomi said softly. I appreciate that. He gave her a reassuring smile before excusing himself, leaving her alone with Michael once more. As the door closed, Naomi sank back into her chair, her mind still racing. She had done what she set out to do, but the battle felt far from over. There were still so many minds to change, so many people who refused to see the truth. You should get some rest, Michael said, breaking the silence. You've earned it. Naomi nodded, though she knew that sleep wouldn't come easily. Her mind was too full of thoughts, too full of questions about what came next. I will, she said, but first I need to figure out what to do now. Michael smiled gently. Whatever it is, you'll figure it out. You always do. Naomi smiled back, but deep down, the doubt still gnawed at her. She had spoken her truth, but would it be enough? Would anything ever be enough? The conference hall buzzed with activity as attendees mingled between sessions, grabbing coffee and chatting in small groups. Naomi stood by one of the tall, round tables near the back of the room, cradling a cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands. The warmth was comforting, but her mind was elsewhere, still spinning from the intensity of her speech and the hours that had followed. After leaving the green room, she had been greeted by a wave of handshakes and polite smiles from fellow doctors, some congratulating her with sincere enthusiasm, others offering vague, non-committal praise. It was the latter group that left her feeling uneasy. While some had been moved by her words, others clearly weren't ready to hear what she had said. Naomi took a sip of her coffee, scanning the room as people moved about. The conversations around her blurred into white noise as she reflected on the whirlwind of the morning. She had done what she set out to do, delivered a powerful speech, laid bare the truth of systemic racism in healthcare, but now that the adrenaline had worn off, the weight of the aftermath settled in. Dr. Davis. A voice called her name from across the room, and Naomi turned to see Dr. Olivia Foster, a respected public health researcher, approaching with a broad smile. Olivia had been one of the few people Naomi had looked up to during her early years in medicine, someone who had always advocated for equity in healthcare even when it wasn't popular. Olivia, hi, Naomi said, returning her smile. I just wanted to say how amazing your speech was, Olivia said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. You didn't pull any punches, and that's exactly what we need right now. Too many people are afraid to talk about racism in medicine, but you went right for it. Naomi felt a small swell of pride at Olivia's words. Thank you. I wasn't sure how it would go over, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. And you shouldn't, Olivia said, nodding. It's about time someone said what we've all been thinking. People like you and I, we've seen firsthand how racism impacts our patients and our careers, but there are still too many in this field who don't want to face that reality. Naomi nodded in agreement, but before she could respond, a familiar figure approached. Dr. Alan Kent, the head of a large hospital network, was making his way through the crowd, his expression unreadable. He had been in the audience during Naomi's speech, and she had seen him sitting toward the back, arms crossed, his face stern and unmoved. Naomi's heart sank as he approached, unsure of what to expect. Dr. Davis, Dr. Kent said, his tone cool and measured. I wanted to speak with you about your presentation. Naomi's stomach tightened. She had anticipated pushback, but now that it was right in front of her, the familiar sense of dread returned. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I must admit," Dr. Kent began, "your speech was bold. You addressed some very sensitive topics, ones that many in our field prefer not to discuss so openly. While I understand your passion for these issues, I'm concerned that some of your remarks may have alienated certain members of the audience." Naomi's grip tightened on her coffee cup, her pulse quickening. She had expected this. Criticism cloaked in polite language, designed to soften the blow, but still cut deep. "With all due respect, Dr. Kent," Naomi said, choosing her words carefully, "these are issues that need to be addressed, even if they make people uncomfortable. Healthcare disparities and racism aren't just abstract concepts. They affect real people every day. And if we continue to avoid these conversations, nothing will change." Dr. Kent's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, disapproval perhaps, in his eyes. "I don't disagree that these issues are important, Dr. Davis," he said. "But we also have to consider the broader context. Our goal is to improve healthcare for everyone, and sometimes focusing too narrowly on certain aspects can create division." Naomi felt a surge of frustration rise within her. It was the same argument she had heard time and time again, that talking about racism was somehow more divisive than racism itself. But before she could respond, Olivia stepped in. "With all due respect, Dr. Kent," Olivia said, her voice firm, "it's exactly this kind of thinking that's holding us back. By refusing to talk about racism, we're perpetuating it. Dr. Davis's speech wasn't about division. It was about confronting the truth so that we can start working toward real solutions." Dr. Kent's jaw tightened, but he said nothing for a moment. Then, with a curt nod, he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders sagging with relief. She turned to Olivia, grateful for her support. "Thank you for that." "Any time," Olivia said, her expression softening. "Don't let people like him get to you. They're the ones who are stuck in the past. You're pushing us forward." Naomi smiled, but the encounter with Dr. Kent had left a sour taste in her mouth. She knew there were more people like him in the audience, people who would rather keep things as they were, who saw conversations about racism as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. And while she had expected pushback, it still stung to see it so plainly. "I guess I should have expected that," Naomi said, her voice tinged with frustration. Olivia nodded. "Unfortunately, that's the reality we're dealing with. But don't lose sight of the fact that there are people who are listening, people who want to help make a change. You're not alone in this." Naomi appreciated Olivia's words, but the doubt was already beginning to creep in again. Had she been too blunt? Too confrontational? She had tried to strike the right balance, but the reaction from Dr. Kent reminded her of how fragile that balance could be. "I know," Naomi said, forcing a smile. "It's just hard sometimes, you know. You want to believe that people will listen, but then you get reminded that there are still so many who don't want to hear it." Olivia placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, her gaze steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Naomi. But you've planted a seed today. Trust that." Naomi nodded, though the weight of the day's events still pressed down on her. As Olivia excused herself to head to another session, Naomi remained by the table, staring into her coffee cup. The doubts that had surfaced in the green room returned in full force. For every person like Olivia, there was someone like Dr. Kent, someone who wasn't ready to confront the truth. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "I saw Dr. Kent come over. Let me guess. He wasn't too happy with your speech?" Naomi looked up to see Michael approaching, his expression both amused and concerned. She gave him a small, tired smile. "How'd you guess?" Michael shook his head. It's always the same with guys like him. They think talking about racism is what causes division, rather than the racism itself. Yeah, that was pretty much his argument, Naomi said, setting her coffee down on the table. It's just frustrating. I knew not everyone would be receptive, but hearing it face to face like that, it's exhausting. Michael's gaze softened. I know, but you're doing the right thing. And for every person like him, there's someone who's ready to listen. You just have to keep pushing. Naomi sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's hard not to feel like I'm just shouting into the void sometimes. Like, how many times do we have to have this conversation before something actually changes? I get it, Michael said. But that's the thing about change. It's slow, frustratingly slow, but it does happen, and you're part of that process, whether you realize it or not. Naomi appreciated his words, but doubt still lingered. She had spent her entire career fighting for change, and while she had made progress, the resistance she faced felt never-ending. I just wish it didn't have to be this hard, Naomi admitted, her voice quiet. Michael nodded. I know, but you're not alone, Naomi. We're all in this together. Naomi met his gaze, feeling a wave of gratitude for his support. She wasn't used to relying on others. She had always been the one to carry the weight, to fight the battles alone. But Michael's presence, along with Olivia's, reminded her that she didn't have to do this by herself. Thanks, Michael, Naomi said softly. I needed to hear that. Michael gave her a small smile. Anytime. As they stood together in the bustling conference hall, Naomi felt a sense of camaraderie that eased some of the weight on her shoulders. She wasn't shouting into the void, and she wasn't alone in this fight. There were others, like Michael, like Olivia, who were standing with her, ready to challenge the system and push for change. But even as that sense of solidarity settled over her, Naomi knew that the road ahead was still long. There would be more people like Dr. Kent, more resistance, more doubt. The fight was far from over. That evening, Naomi returned to her hotel room, emotionally drained but determined to push forward. She had several meetings scheduled the next day with potential collaborators, including policymakers and healthcare executives interested in expanding her advocacy work into broader initiatives. It was a promising step forward, but the weight of her earlier encounters lingered in her mind. She sank onto the edge of her bed, staring at the city lights outside her window. New York City was always bustling, always alive with energy and possibility, but tonight it felt distant. She had come here with a mission, and while she had made progress, the reactions of people like Dr. Kent reminded her of how entrenched the system truly was. It was exhausting to think that for every step forward, there would always be someone trying to pull her back. Her phone buzzed and she glanced down to see a message from Aisha. Aisha. Hey, just checking in. How are you feeling after the speech? Need to vent? Naomi chuckled softly, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. She typed out a quick reply, Naomi. Exhausted, honestly. The speech went well, but there's been some pushback. Dr. Kent wasn't too thrilled. Aisha's response came almost immediately. Aisha. Of course he wasn't. But don't let him get to you. You're doing important work. These conversations are supposed to make people uncomfortable. That's how change happens. Naomi smiled, feeling the tension in her chest ease slightly. Aisha had a way of cutting through the noise, of reminding Naomi why she did what she did. It wasn't about pleasing everyone, it was about making people listen even when they didn't want to. Naomi, you're right. I just wish it didn't have to be this hard. Aisha, I know, girl, but you're stronger than this. You've been fighting this fight your whole life, and you've already accomplished so much. Don't let a few old white men with outdated ideas slow you down. Naomi laughed softly, shaking her head. Naomi, thanks, Aisha. You always know what to say. Aisha, That's what I'm here for. Now go get some rest and remember, you're a badass. Naomi set her phone down, smiling to herself. Aisha's words lifted her spirits, reminding her of her own strength. She had come so far, fought so hard to get to this point. She couldn't let the doubts and resistance of a few detractors hold her back. But as she lay down on the bed, the weight of the day still pressed down on her. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more meetings, more conversations about how to turn her words into action. The idea excited her, but it also exhausted her. How many more battles would she have to fight? How many more times would she have to convince people that her experiences and the experiences of others like her were valid? As Naomi closed her eyes, she thought back to her time in medical school, to the years she had spent proving herself over and over again. She had always been the only black woman in the room, always the one who had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. And now, even after everything she had accomplished, she was still fighting for the same things. It was exhausting, but she couldn't stop now. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin hotel curtains, casting a soft glow across the room as Naomi slowly woke up. Her body was still heavy with exhaustion, but her mind immediately snapped back to the reality of the day ahead. She had important meetings lined up, meetings that could set the stage for the kind of real change she had been pushing for. Yet the weight of doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. After everything she had been through in the last 24 hours, the high of her speech, the mixed reactions from the audience, the subtle resistance from colleagues like Dr. Kent, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a battle with no end in sight. She pulled herself out of bed, her movements slow as she prepared for the day. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who was poised, professional, but beneath the surface she could feel the cracks. It wasn't just the exhaustion from the physical demands of the conference, it was the emotional toll of constantly being the one to raise the issue of racism, to demand that others see the world as she saw it. Every time she stepped into a room full of her colleagues, she knew that her presence was both expected and resented. As she dressed in a simple but elegant black dress and blazer, Naomi's phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Aisha again, just like the night before. Aisha. Morning, superstar. I know today's another big day. Go show them what you're made of. You've got this. Naomi smiled, the encouragement a small comfort as she took a deep breath and typed back, Naomi. Thanks, Aisha. Just trying to keep my head in the game. It's going to be a long one. Aisha, you'll crush it. Remember who you are. With Aisha's words echoing in her mind, Naomi grabbed her bag, her notes, and the weight of her responsibility, then headed out the door. The conference center awaited, and with it, a new round of conversations, confrontations, and the ever-present struggle to move the needle just a little further toward progress. The first meeting of the day was with a group of healthcare executives, people who had the power and the resources to fund initiatives that would help address the healthcare disparities Naomi had dedicated her life to combating. She had met with several of these executives before, and while some of them were genuinely interested in equity, others were more concerned with optics, doing just enough to appear progressive without making any real changes. As Naomi entered the sleek conference room where the meeting was scheduled to take place, she was greeted by Deborah Langston, the head of a major hospital chain, and a handful of other executives. Deborah was one of the few women at the top of the healthcare field, a sharp, no-nonsense leader who had built her reputation on efficiency and innovation. Naomi, good to see you again, Deborah said with a warm but professional smile, extending her hand. Good to see you too, Deborah, Naomi replied, shaking her hand. As the rest of the executives filed into the room, Naomi couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. These were powerful people, people who controlled budgets, policy decisions and the future direction of healthcare institutions. Naomi had a seat at the table today, but she knew that just because she was in the room didn't mean her voice would carry the weight it deserved. Once everyone was seated, Deborah took the lead. Naomi, I wanted to personally thank you for your keynote speech yesterday. I've heard a lot of buzz about it, both positive and, well, let's just say some people are feeling a bit challenged. Naomi smiled politely, though she knew what Deborah was implying. The challenged people were the ones like Dr. Kent, the ones who found it difficult to confront the realities of systemic racism in healthcare. I'm glad the speech is sparking conversation, Naomi said. That was my goal. We can't fix what we refuse to acknowledge. Absolutely, Deborah agreed. That's why I wanted to have this meeting. We're interested in exploring how we can support your work, whether it's through funding, partnerships, or advocacy. Naomi felt a flicker of hope. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for, a chance to turn her words into action, to secure the resources needed to expand her advocacy work. That sounds great, Naomi said, leaning forward slightly. I think we have a real chance to make an impact, especially if we focus on building programs that address healthcare disparities in underserved communities. But it can't just be about funding. It needs to be about changing the way we think about healthcare as a whole. One of the other executives, David Sullivan, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a stern expression, spoke up. Naomi, I agree that healthcare disparities are a problem we need to address, but I think we need to be careful about how we approach it. There's a fine line between advocating for equity and, well, alienating certain parts of our patient population. Naomi blinked, her calm exterior hiding the simmering frustration she felt. What exactly do you mean by that? David shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I just think that if we focus too much on race, we run the risk of alienating some of our patients, particularly those who don't see themselves as part of the problem. It's a delicate balance, and we don't want to lose the trust of our broader patient base. Naomi's pulse quickened. This was the same argument she had heard from Dr. Kent and so many others. The idea that discussing racism would somehow alienate people who refuse to see it was one of the biggest obstacles to real change. With all due respect, David, Naomi said, her voice steady but firm. The trust we need to build is with the communities that have been marginalized and ignored for far too long. If we keep prioritizing the comfort of those who don't want to acknowledge the problem, then we're just perpetuating the very inequities we claim to be addressing. There was a moment of silence as David considered her words. Deborah, sensing the tension, stepped in. I think what Naomi is saying is that we can't be afraid to have uncomfortable conversations. That's the only way we'll make real progress. Naomi glanced at Deborah, grateful for her support, but she could still feel the resistance in the room. Some of the executives shifted in their seats, their faces betraying their discomfort. These were people who were used to wielding power, but they weren't used to being told that they were part of the problem. The rest of the meeting continued with polite but guarded discussion. By the end of it, Naomi had secured a tentative agreement to explore potential partnerships, but she knew that the road ahead would be filled with more of the same resistance. For every step forward, there would be people like David pulling them back, afraid of the change they so desperately needed. After the meeting, Naomi stepped out into the bustling lobby of the conference center, her head swimming with thoughts. The conversation with the executives had gone as well as could be expected, but she couldn't shake the feeling of frustration that had followed her since yesterday. She had made progress, yes, but it wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. As she stood by one of the large glass windows overlooking the city, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from Michael. Michael, how's it going? Need a break? Naomi hesitated for a moment before replying, Naomi, Just finished a meeting. Could definitely use a break. Michael, meet me in the park outside the conference center in 10. Naomi smiled, grateful for the offer. Naomi, be there soon. She made her way outside, the cool breeze hitting her face as she stepped into the park. The hustle and noise of the city seemed to fade as she spotted Michael sitting on a bench near the fountain, his expression relaxed but focused. Hey, Naomi said as she approached, sitting beside him. Hey, Michael replied with a smile. How'd the meeting go? Naomi sighed, leaning back against the bench. About as well as could be expected. They're interested, but there's still so much hesitation. People worried about alienating patients or making things too political. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I've seen that before. People don't want to confront what makes them uncomfortable, but it sounds like you're making progress. I guess, Naomi said, her voice tinged with frustration. It just feels like we're constantly fighting an uphill battle. For every person who gets it, there are 10 more who don't. Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. That's true. But look at what you've already done. You've started a conversation that most people would rather avoid. That's huge, Naomi. And yeah, it's going to be hard and it's going to take time, but you're already making a difference. Naomi turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. Michael had been one of her biggest supporters since they had met on the plane, and his unwavering belief in her was both comforting and, at times, overwhelming. I just don't know how much longer I can keep fighting like this, Naomi admitted, her voice quiet. It's exhausting. Michael's gaze softened. I know, but you don't have to do it alone. There are people who believe in what you're doing, people who are ready to stand with you, and I'm one of them. Naomi felt a lump rise in her throat, the weight of her emotions catching up with her. She had spent so long carrying the burden of this fight, of constantly being the one to push for change, that she hadn't allowed herself to really lean on anyone. But Michael's words, his presence, made her realize that maybe she didn't have to bear it all on her own. Thank you, Naomi said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. I don't think I've said that enough. Michael smiled. You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what's right. And I know you'd do the same for me. Naomi nodded, her heart swelling with appreciation. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Not just for the work ahead, but for the possibility that she didn't have to fight every battle alone. They sat in silence for a few moments, the noise of the city blending into the background as they watched the fountain's water cascade gently into the pool below. You know, Michael said after a while, his voice light, I think you should take the rest of the afternoon off. Naomi raised an eyebrow, surprised. And do what? Something other than fighting the system for a few hours, Michael said with a grin. We're in New York. Let's go grab some food, take a walk, anything. Just give yourself a break. You deserve it. Naomi hesitated, but then smiled, feeling a weight lifted off her shoulders. You know what? That sounds perfect. As they stood up and made their way out of the park, Naomi felt a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in days. There was still so much work to be done, so many battles left to fight. But for now, she would allow herself this small moment of peace. She had fought hard, and she would continue to fight. But she wasn't alone. Naomi and Michael spent the afternoon wandering through the streets of New York, the tension of the conference fading with each step. The city was alive with its usual energy. People hurrying past on their way to meetings, tourists snapping photos of skyscrapers, the constant hum of traffic creating a backdrop of white noise that somehow felt soothing after the intense atmosphere of the conference center. They found a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, a welcome contrast to the fast-paced world outside. The cozy warmth of the cafe wrapped around them as they slid into a booth by the window, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pastries filling the air. Naomi hadn't realized how hungry she was until she sat down, her stomach growling in anticipation. Michael ordered for both of them, lattes and croissants, and as they waited for their food, Naomi leaned back in her chair, allowing herself to relax for the first time in what felt like weeks. "So," Michael said, his eyes twinkling with amusement, "are you finally taking a breath?" Naomi chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Yeah, I guess I am. It's been a whirlwind, and I'm not used to slowing down." "I figured," Michael said, leaning forward with a smile. "That's why I thought a break was in order. You can't keep running on empty." Naomi nodded, taking in his words. He was right. She had been pushing herself nonstop for so long, carrying the weight of her advocacy work, her medical career, and the constant battle for recognition in a field that wasn't designed for people like her. She hadn't allowed herself much room to just breathe, to step back and enjoy the simple things. As their lattes arrived, Naomi took a sip, savoring the rich, warm flavor as it spread through her chest. It was a small pleasure, but at that moment, it felt like exactly what she needed. "You know," Naomi said, setting her cup down, "I used to love these quiet moments. When I first started medical school, I would take myself out for coffee between classes just to clear my head, but then everything got so intense. I guess I forgot how to slow down." Michael smiled, his eyes soft with understanding. "Yeah, life has a way of doing that, but it's important to find those moments again. You deserve that, Naomi." Naomi smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her. She hadn't expected to feel this comfortable, this at ease with someone she had met only days ago. But Michael's presence was calming, and his unwavering support had become something she didn't realize she needed until now. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their work, their frustrations, their hopes for the future. Naomi found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in a long time, and Michael listened with a quiet attentiveness that made her feel truly heard. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the city streets, they decided to take a walk through one of the nearby parks. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, their leaves catching the last rays of sunlight as they strolled down the path. For the first time in days, Naomi allowed herself to feel light, to let go of the constant pressure that weighed her down. She knew that the challenges of her work weren't over, that the road ahead was still long and filled with obstacles, but in this moment she felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," Naomi said softly as they walked. "For everything. I didn't realize how much I needed this." Michael smiled, glancing at her with warmth. "You don't have to thank me, Naomi. I'm just glad I could be here." They continued walking in silence, the peace of the evening settling over them like a gentle embrace. Naomi knew that tomorrow would bring more meetings, more conversations, more fights for justice. But for now, she allowed herself to savor the calm before the storm. The next morning, Naomi woke up feeling more rested than she had in days. The afternoon spent with Michael had given her the space to breathe, the chance to recharge and let go of the pressure she had been carrying since her keynote speech. But now, as the sunlight crept through the hotel curtains, she knew it was time to dive back into the fray. Today was her last full day at the conference, and Naomi had a packed schedule of meetings and panels to attend. After the speech, her presence had been in high demand. People wanted to hear more from her, to tap into her insights about addressing healthcare disparities. Some were eager to collaborate, but others, like Dr. Kent, were wary, hesitant to commit to anything that might shake the system too much. Naomi sat at the small desk in her hotel room, reviewing her notes for the day. She had meetings with hospital administrators, potential partners for community health initiatives, and a roundtable discussion on healthcare reform. But the meeting she was dreading most was a one-on-one with Dr. Kent. It had been scheduled after their tense exchange, and Naomi wasn't sure whether he wanted to continue the conversation or simply smooth over the awkwardness with empty pleasantries. Either way, she wasn't looking forward to it. As she packed her bag, her phone buzzed with a message from Michael. "Michael, good luck today. Let me know if you need another coffee break." Naomi smiled, her nerves settling slightly as she replied, "Naomi, thanks. Might take you up on that later. It's going to be a long day." With a deep breath, she grabbed her bag and headed out the door, ready to face whatever the day had in store for her. The first meeting of the day went smoothly. Naomi had spoken with a group of hospital administrators who were genuinely interested in addressing healthcare disparities. They discussed potential collaborations, community outreach programs, and the importance of training medical staff to recognize and combat racial bias. It was the kind of productive conversation Naomi had hoped for, and it left her feeling optimistic. But as the morning wore on, the weight of the upcoming meeting with Dr. Kent loomed larger in her mind. By lunchtime, Naomi felt the familiar knot of tension forming in her stomach. She had faced men like Dr. Kent before, people who didn't believe they were part of the problem, people who thought their position of power exempted them from accountability. Still, Naomi was determined not to shy away from the conversation. If she was going to push for real change, she couldn't avoid difficult discussions with the people who had the most influence. After a quick bite to eat, Naomi made her way to the private meeting room where she was scheduled to meet Dr. Kent. The room was quiet, its large windows offering a view of the bustling city below. As she waited, Naomi ran through potential responses in her head, preparing herself for whatever direction the conversation might take. Dr. Kent arrived a few minutes later, his expression neutral but cordial. He extended his hand and Naomi shook it, offering a polite smile as they both sat down. "Thank you for meeting with me, Dr. Davis," Dr. Kent began, his tone professional. "I wanted to follow up on some of the points you raised in your speech and our conversation yesterday." Naomi nodded, her posture calm but alert. "I'm glad you wanted to continue the conversation. These are important issues, and I think we need to dig deeper if we're going to make meaningful progress." Dr. Kent folded his hands on the table, his gaze steady. "I agree that healthcare disparities are a serious problem. However, I think we need to be careful about how we approach these conversations, especially in such public forums. There's a delicate balance to strike between raising awareness and, how should I put this, alienating certain stakeholders." Naomi felt her pulse quicken, the frustration she had suppressed during their last exchange bubbling to the surface. "With all due respect, Dr. Kent, the reality of systemic racism isn't something we can afford to soften or downplay. If people feel alienated by the truth, then maybe that's exactly why we need to have these conversations. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away." Dr. Kent's expression tightened, though his tone remained measured. "I understand your passion for this issue, Naomi, but in my experience, change happens incrementally. If we push too hard, too fast, we risk losing the support of key figures in the healthcare industry. These are people who have the power to make or break these initiatives." Naomi's jaw clenched as she took in his words. This was the same argument she had heard time and time again. The idea that change needed to be gradual, that she should be patient, that pushing too hard would backfire. But Naomi knew better. She had seen firsthand how the healthcare system failed Black and brown communities, how the pace of incremental change was never fast enough for the people who needed it most. "I understand that change takes time," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "But what we're talking about isn't a new issue. Communities of color have been suffering the consequences of healthcare disparities for generations. We can't keep asking people to wait for change that might never come if we're too afraid to confront the real problem head-on. Dr. Kent sighed, leaning back in his chair. I hear what you're saying, but I also have to consider the bigger picture. If we alienate too many people, we lose the chance to make even the smallest improvements, and sometimes small improvements are better than nothing. Naomi's frustration flared again, but she kept her composure. The bigger picture you're talking about is exactly why we need bold action. We can't keep settling for small improvements when the system itself is broken. We need to be willing to make people uncomfortable, to challenge the status quo. Otherwise, nothing will ever change. Dr. Kent was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he spoke, his tone more conciliatory. You make valid points, Naomi. I don't disagree with the need for change. I just think we need to be strategic about how we go about it. Naomi nodded, though she knew they were still miles apart in their approaches. I appreciate your willingness to discuss this, Dr. Kent. But we can't let fear of discomfort hold us back. The people who are suffering don't have time to wait for incremental change. Dr. Kent offered a polite smile. I'll take your thoughts into consideration as we move forward. Thank you for your time, Doctor. Davis Naomi stood, shaking his hand again before leaving the room. As she walked down the hallway, she felt a mix of emotions, frustration, exhaustion, but also a renewed sense of determination. She knew that people like Dr. Kent wouldn't change overnight, but she also knew that she couldn't afford to slow down or soften her approach for the sake of their comfort. There was too much at stake. The conference wound down as the day progressed, but Naomi's mind was still spinning from her conversation with Dr. Kent. It wasn't just his resistance that bothered her, it was the realization that despite all her efforts, the healthcare system she had dedicated her life to was still entrenched in the same cycles of complacency and reluctance to change. As she prepared for her final panel of the day, a discussion on the future of healthcare equity, Naomi felt a growing sense of conflict within herself. She had spent her career fighting for incremental progress, believing that each small victory would add up to something greater. But now, after years of pushing for change and encountering the same resistance, she wondered if her approach had been too cautious. Had she been holding back, trying to accommodate people like Dr. Kent, when she should have been demanding more? The panel discussion started smoothly, with a mix of voices offering perspectives on how to address healthcare disparities. Naomi spoke about the importance of community health programs and training medical professionals to recognize and address racial bias. But as the conversation progressed, she found herself growing restless. The other panelists, while well-meaning, seemed to be offering the same solutions she had heard 100 times before. Better data collection, increased funding for research, more diversity in hiring practices. These were all important steps, but they weren't enough. They weren't addressing the root of the problem, the systemic racism that underpinned the entire healthcare industry. Naomi's heart pounded as she debated whether to speak up, to push the conversation in a more radical direction. She knew that doing so could alienate some of the people in the room, people who had the power to fund and support her work. But she also knew that staying silent, sticking to the safe, incremental solutions, wasn't going to bring about the change she was fighting for. As the moderator turned to Naomi for her closing thoughts, she made a decision. I appreciate the ideas that have been shared today, Naomi began, her voice steady but laced with conviction. But I think we're missing something crucial in this conversation. We keep talking about the symptoms of the problem, disparities in care, lack of representation, funding gaps, but we're not talking about the cause. And the cause is systemic racism. The room grew quiet as Naomi continued, her words cutting through the polite, measured tone of the panel. The healthcare system wasn't built for people of color, Naomi said, her gaze sweeping the room. It was built to serve a select few, and the rest of us have been left to navigate a system that devalues our lives. We can't keep pretending that small changes, more data, more diversity, are enough. We need to dismantle the structures that perpetuate inequality and rebuild them in a way that serves everyone. The tension in the room was palpable, but Naomi pressed on. I know these conversations make people uncomfortable. I know it's easier to focus on surface-level solutions that don't challenge the status quo. But the truth is, the status quo is killing people. And if we're serious about healthcare equity, we need to be willing to face that truth, no matter how hard it is. When Naomi finished, there was a beat of silence before the applause began. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't the kind of overwhelming support she had received after her keynote speech, but it was there. And at that moment, Naomi knew she had made the right choice. She had spoken her truth, and that was what mattered. After the panel, Naomi stepped outside for some fresh air. The cool evening breeze was a welcome relief from the intensity of the conference, and as she stood on the steps of the conference center, she let herself breathe. The doubts she had carried with her all day began to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. She had made her choice. She wasn't going to hold back anymore. She wasn't going to settle for small improvements or cater to the comfort of those who didn't want to face the truth. From now on, Naomi was going to demand more, not just for herself, but for the people and communities who had been ignored for far too long. As she stood there, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Michael. Michael, saw the live stream of your panel. You crushed it. Proud of you. Naomi smiled, her heart lifting as she typed out a response. Naomi, thanks. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. Michael, it was. Let's grab dinner later to celebrate? Naomi hesitated for a moment, then smiled again. Naomi, sounds good. I'll meet you at the usual spot. As she slipped her phone back into her pocket, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't afraid of making people uncomfortable. She wasn't afraid of pushing harder, demanding more. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence it again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. After returning home from the conference, Naomi dove headfirst into her work, fueled by the momentum of the speeches, meetings, and the support she had garnered from those who believed in her vision. Her inbox was flooded with emails from colleagues, community leaders, and potential partners who wanted to collaborate on projects aimed at addressing healthcare disparities. But along with the support came the inevitable resistance. Naomi received pushback from hospital administrators who weren't ready to fully commit to the bold changes she was advocating for. There were veiled criticisms from some of her peers, suggesting that she was being too radical or too aggressive in her approach. Naomi had expected this. She had been preparing for it her entire career. But that didn't make it any less exhausting. Still, she pressed on. She worked late nights drafting proposals, organizing meetings, and building coalitions with like-minded advocates who shared her passion for dismantling systemic racism in healthcare. Her days were long, but the sense of purpose that had driven her for so long now felt sharper, clearer than ever before. One afternoon, as Naomi sat in her office, reviewing a grant proposal for a new community health initiative, her phone rang. It was Michael. "Hey," Naomi said, picking up the call. "What's up?" "I've got some news," Michael said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Remember that proposal we worked on for the city's healthcare equity fund?" "Yeah," Naomi replied, her heart quickening. "What about it?" "We got it," Michael said, his voice breaking into a smile. "The city's approved the funding for our project. We're officially launching the initiative." Naomi's breath caught in her throat, a rush of relief and joy flooding through her. "Are you serious, Michael? That's amazing." "I know," Michael said, his tone still buzzing with excitement. "This is huge, Naomi. We're going to be able to do real on-the-ground work. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Naomi leaned back in her chair, letting the news sink in. After months of pushing, after years of fighting for change, they had finally secured the resources they needed to make a real impact. "This is just the beginning," Naomi said, her voice filled with determination. "We're going to make this count. We're going to show them what's possible." Michael chuckled. "I have no doubt. You've always known what needs to be done, Naomi, and now we have the means to do it." As they continued to discuss the details of the project, Naomi felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where her work could finally translate into tangible change. There were still obstacles ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt like she was on the brink of something truly transformative. After the call ended, Naomi sat at her desk, staring out the window at the city skyline. The road ahead would be long, but she wasn't walking it alone. She had allies, people like Michael, Olivia, and the countless others who had joined her in this fight. And together they were going to push forward no matter how hard it got. Naomi reached for her phone again, typing out a quick message to Aisha. "Naomi, we did it. The project's been approved. It's happening." Aisha's response came almost immediately. "Aisha, yes. I knew you would do it. This is only the beginning, Naomi. The world better get ready for you." Naomi smiled, her heart full. Aisha had been right all along. This was just the beginning. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. The next few months were a whirlwind for Naomi. After securing funding for the Healthcare Equity Initiative, her days became a blur of meetings, planning sessions, and outreach efforts. She was working closely with Michael and a core team of doctors, community leaders, and healthcare advocates, all united by a shared vision: to create a healthcare system that truly served marginalized communities. The initiative, officially named the Equity and Care Alliance, ECA, was ambitious in scope. It aimed to address both the immediate needs of underserved populations and the long-term structural issues that perpetuated disparities. The plan involved setting up mobile clinics in low-income neighborhoods, training healthcare providers on recognizing and addressing implicit bias, and establishing partnerships with local organizations to ensure that care was both accessible and culturally competent. Naomi had never felt more energized. This was what she had been working toward for her entire career, a chance to implement real, lasting change. But with excitement came immense pressure. There were countless moving parts to manage, and every day brought a new challenge. Negotiating contracts with hospital systems, navigating bureaucratic red tape, dealing with skeptical policymakers who weren't fully convinced of the initiative's potential. One afternoon, Naomi sat in her office reviewing a proposal for expanding the mobile clinics. Her desk was cluttered with reports, emails, and notes from various meetings. She had been at it since 6 a.m., and it was now well past noon. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from Michael. "Michael, lunch break? You've been at it all day." Naomi smiled, knowing she hadn't taken a real break in hours. She quickly replied, "Naomi, meet you at the cafe in 20? Michael, deal. Don't forget to eat this time." Naomi chuckled to herself. Michael had become her sounding board, her partner in this venture, and a constant reminder to take care of herself. As much as she loved the work, she was grateful for his presence, someone who understood the stakes but also knew when to pull her away from the grind. The small cafe where Naomi and Michael often met had become something of a refuge for her, a place where she could step away from the intensity of her work and just breathe. When she arrived, Michael was already seated at a table by the window, 2 sandwiches and iced coffees in front of him. "You're a lifesaver," Naomi said with a grin as she sat down, reaching for her sandwich. "Just trying to keep you alive," Michael joked, taking a sip of his coffee. "How's it going? I saw the draft of the proposal for the clinics. It looks solid." Naomi nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Yeah, it's coming together. I'm just worried about the logistics. The demand is huge, and we need more resources than I initially thought. We're already stretched thin." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but that's why this project is so important. If it were easy, it wouldn't be worth doing. We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Naomi appreciated his calm demeanor, the way he always managed to reassure her when her doubts started creeping in. "I know, I want to make sure we're doing this right. There's so much riding on this." "You are doing it right," Michael said, his voice steady. "This isn't just another program, Naomi. This is you changing the system from the inside out. And yeah, there will be challenges, but that's part of the process. Don't lose sight of what you've already accomplished." Naomi looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had spent so much of her career fighting battles alone, but now she had a team, people who believed in her vision and were willing to fight alongside her. "Thanks," Naomi said, her voice soft but sincere. "I don't think I've said it enough, but I really couldn't do this without you." Michael smiled, a warmth in his eyes. "You don't have to say it. I'm just glad to be part of something that matters." They continued eating in comfortable silence. The weight of their work briefly lifted as they enjoyed the simple pleasure of a meal shared between friends. For the first time in a long time, Naomi felt a sense of balance, a recognition that while the fight was far from over, she didn't have to carry it all on her own. As the Equity and Care Alliance grew, so did its impact. The mobile clinics were a resounding success, providing free medical care to neighborhoods that had long been neglected by the healthcare system. Naomi and her team worked tirelessly to ensure that these clinics were more than just stopgaps. They were safe spaces where people could access quality care without fear of judgment or discrimination. Word spread quickly about the ECA, and soon more organizations and hospitals wanted to partner with Naomi's team. Local community leaders were enthusiastic about the initiative, helping to connect residents with services and advocating for more resources. One afternoon, Naomi was visiting one of the mobile clinics in Harlem, where a steady stream of patients had been arriving since early morning. As she walked through the clinic, greeting the staff and speaking with patients, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the work she had always dreamed of doing, directly serving the people who needed it most. She stopped by a small waiting area where a mother sat with her 2 young children, one of whom was coughing softly into her arm. "Hi there," Naomi said warmly, kneeling down to the child's level. "How are you feeling today?" The little girl, no more than 6 years old, looked up with wide eyes, clearly shy but curious. Her mother smiled gratefully at Naomi. "She's been having some trouble breathing," the mother explained, her voice tired but relieved. "But I couldn't get an appointment anywhere. This clinic has been a godsend." Naomi's heart swelled. This was why she had fought so hard for the ECA, for families like this one, who had been left out of the healthcare system for too long. "We'll make sure she gets the care she needs," Naomi said, standing up and placing a reassuring hand on the mother's shoulder. "You're in good hands here." The mother smiled again, her eyes welling up with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much." As Naomi walked away, she felt a deep sense of purpose. Every interaction like this reminded her of why she had dedicated her life to this work. It wasn't just about the policies or the programs. It was about the people, the families, the children whose lives were being changed because someone cared enough to fight for them. Later that afternoon, Naomi sat down with Dr. Celia Ramirez, one of the lead physicians at the clinic. Celia was a passionate advocate for healthcare equity and had been one of the first doctors to join the ECA initiative. "Things are running smoothly here," Celia said, sipping her coffee as they sat together in a small break room. "We're seeing more patients every week, and the word is definitely spreading." Naomi nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "That's great to hear. I'm hoping we can replicate this model in other cities soon." Celia smiled. "You will. This is just the beginning. And I have to say, Naomi, you've built something incredible here. I've never seen a program that's this focused on community and equity. It's rare, and it's making a difference." Naomi's chest tightened with emotion. She had always believed in the power of this work, but hearing it affirmed by someone like Celia, someone who was in the trenches with her every day, meant the world. "Thank you, Celia," Naomi said, her voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you and the rest of the team. This isn't just my vision, it's all of ours." Celia nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. "True, but you're the one who pushed it forward, and we're all behind you." As they sat together, discussing the future of the ECA and the challenges ahead, Naomi felt more connected to her work than ever before. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the community they had built, the network of people who shared her passion for justice and equity. As the months passed, Naomi found herself thinking more and more about the journey that had brought her to this point. The long hours, the difficult conversations, the moments of doubt and frustration, they had all led to something meaningful, something tangible. But as proud as she was of the ECA's success, Naomi knew there was still so much more to be done. One evening, after a long day of meetings and clinic visits, Naomi sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, gazing out at the city skyline. The stars fainted against the bright lights of New York, but they were there, twinkling in the distance. The cool night air was refreshing, and for the first time in weeks, Naomi allowed herself to simply be still. As she stared out at the city, her mind drifted back to the early days of her career, the long hours in medical school, the constant pressure to prove herself in a field dominated by people who didn't look like her, the microaggressions she had endured from colleagues and patients alike. She had always known that being a black woman in medicine would come with challenges, but she hadn't fully understood just how deep those challenges would run until she was in the thick of it. But despite all the obstacles, despite all the moments when she had questioned whether she could keep going, Naomi had never given up. She had pushed through doubt, resistance, the fear, and now she was seeing the fruits of that labor. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from Aisha. "Aisha, I saw the article about the ECA in the paper today. You're a superstar, Naomi. So proud of you." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with pride. The ECA had been featured in a local newspaper earlier that week, and the article highlighted the impact of mobile clinics and the work they were doing to address healthcare disparities in the city. "Naomi, thanks, Aisha. It's been a crazy ride, but it's all worth it. Aisha, you're changing the world, one step at a time. Don't ever forget that." Naomi's eyes welled with tears as she read the message. Aisha had been there for her through every step of this journey, through the highs and the lows, the victories and the setbacks. She had always believed in Naomi, even when Naomi had struggled to believe in herself. "Naomi, I won't forget. Thank you for always having my back." As Naomi set her phone down, she leaned back against the rooftop railing, taking in the vastness of the city before her. She thought about the future, the expansion of the ECA, the continued fight for healthcare equity, the countless lives still waiting to be touched by their work. There was still so much left to do, but Naomi no longer felt the crushing weight of it all. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had a team, a community, and the unwavering support of people like Aisha and Michael. For the first time in a long time, Naomi allowed herself to breathe deeply, to savor the moment of peace. She had come so far, and while the road ahead was still long, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The following week, Naomi stood in front of a room full of healthcare professionals, policymakers, and community leaders at a major healthcare conference in Washington, D.C. It was a significant moment, not just for her, but for the ECA. They had been invited to present their model for addressing healthcare disparities to a national audience, and Naomi knew that this was the opportunity they had been working toward. As she looked out at the crowd, Naomi felt a sense of calm. This wasn't like the keynote speech she had given months ago, where she had been filled with nerves and uncertainty. This time she knew exactly what she wanted to say, and she had the results to back it up. She began her presentation by sharing the story of the Equity in Care Alliance, how it had started as a vision, a dream of creating a more equitable healthcare system, and how it had grown into a powerful force for change. She spoke about the success of mobile clinics, the partnerships they had forged with hospitals and community organizations, and the lives they had touched on. But she didn't shy away from the challenges either. Naomi was honest about the resistance they had faced, the pushback from people who didn't want to confront the reality of systemic racism in healthcare. She talked about the long hours, the difficult conversations, and the moments of doubt. But she also spoke about the importance of persistence in continuing to push for change, even when it seemed impossible. As she wrapped up her presentation, Naomi looked out at the audience, her voice filled with conviction. "We have a responsibility," she said, her gaze steady. "A responsibility to ensure that every person, regardless of their race, their income, or their background, has access to quality health care. The disparities we're facing aren't new, and they won't be solved overnight, but we can't wait any longer. The time for change is now." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Naomi's words settling over the audience. And then slowly, the applause began. It grew louder, more insistent, until the entire room was on its feet, clapping in recognition of the work Naomi and her team had done. Naomi stood at the podium, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. This was what she had fought for, this moment, this acknowledgement that change was possible, that their work was making a difference. As the applause continued, Naomi felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew that the fight wasn't over, that there were still battles to be won and challenges to overcome, but for the first time she felt like they were truly moving forward toward a future where healthcare equity wasn't just a dream, but a reality. After the presentation, Naomi stepped off the stage and was immediately greeted by Michael, who had been sitting in the front row. His face was lit with pride as he pulled her into a quick hug. "You were incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Thank you," Naomi replied, feeling a rush of emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." Michael smiled, his eyes warm. "You did the hard part, Naomi. You always have." Naomi laughed softly, shaking her head. "Maybe, but it doesn't feel as hard when I know I've got people like you in my corner." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, I'm not going anywhere. We've still got a lot of work to do." Naomi smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, we do." As they walked together out of the conference hall, Naomi felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she wasn't afraid. She had found her purpose, and she knew that whatever challenges came her way, she was ready to face them. Because this time, she wasn't fighting alone. Years later, as Naomi looked back on the journey she had taken, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. The Equity in Care Alliance had grown beyond anything she had ever imagined. The mobile clinics had expanded to cities across the country, and the initiative had inspired similar programs in other parts of the world. But it wasn't just about the numbers. It was about the people, the patients who had received care, the doctors who had been trained to recognize their own biases, the communities that had been empowered to demand better from their healthcare system. Naomi's work had left a lasting impact, one that would continue long after she had moved on to other endeavors. She had built something that mattered, something that would stand the test of time. As she sat in her office, the sun setting outside her window, Naomi thought about the future, about the next generation of doctors, advocates, and leaders who would carry the torch forward. The fight for healthcare equity wasn't over, but she knew that it was in good hands. And as for her, Naomi smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace. She had done her part. She had fought for what was right, and she had won. Now it was time to let others take the lead. But she would always be there, watching from the sidelines, ready to lend a hand whenever it was needed. Because the work was never truly done. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring and thought-provoking narratives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an